at 2 meetings we had in Switzerland, and I really enjoyed his talk, and I think it would be a great speaker for this data science opening. So just to say a few words, I could spend all your time, Anatol, when I go through your whole CV, it has so many interesting points. So he actually started with chemistry in Frankfurt. He has a PhD from ETH in Zurich, and he had lots of academic positions in the US and although in Europe. So in the last years, he was in Basel, and very recently, I actually found out only at the time when I looked up Anatol for inviting him, he actually switched to the University of Vienna. So Anatol is well known for his research at the border of theoretical chemistry and machine learning. He has won several prizes. He has an ERC consolidator grant, and he has a Google unrestricted research grant. I don't want to know what that actually means. So it looks like a good situation for doing interesting work. And yeah, Anatol, we are really happy that you accepted to be here and give a presentation to us and shed some light into this interesting field at the interface of data science, machine learning, and chemistry and physics. So with this, I think we switch the slides. So we will look at yours, which are probably more interesting than mine. And looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Matthias. I started sharing my slide. I hope that's okay, that it works now. So it's really a pleasure to be virtually with you all and to be given this this opportunity to share a little bit the things we've been doing. So I think I didn't know about DASHH and HIDA, and it sounds really exciting, and I hope that this talk does justice to these ambitious goals. So we are really interested in chemical compound space, and I'll try to briefly motivate things for that, but I'll also want to share some of the more recent results which we have published or which are about to be published. So chemical compound space is used in many ways as a term, and we like to use quantum mechanics to understand this, and within quantum mechanics we try to rely on regression techniques, so modern statistical learning, but we also like to use perturbation theory to explore the space, and so all of that really positions us at an interesting interface between computing, even high performance computing, between theoretical chemistry and physics, and possible application areas, maybe in materials. So there's a lot of interest, of course, in renewable energy solutions. For many years I worked for national labs in the US, funded by the Department of Energy. So these materials questions, materials design questions are very of high interest, but due to the fundamental nature of things, of course, all matter is made up of atoms. One could even also venture into biological applications, but so typically in our work, we stay more on the fundamental side of things. And the hope is then, of course, to connect with the corresponding collaborators to more relevant applications. So this is a little bit as an outset. Now, to maybe more specifically motivate this, this was a slide actually which was shown by Alana Spuru-Bucik, who's also a very important scientist working on this area of robotics and AI for chemistry. He showed this slide at the workshop where Matthias and I met in Switzerland 2 years ago, and it's from Barron's, a snapshot from the journal here. Barron's is the weekly issue of the Wall Street Journal, and there's a bold estimate for the next decade. Of course, predicting the future is always tricky, but these people are not shy to do so, and they think gene editing, quantum computing, and materials on demand are among those topics that will be important. The materials on demand was interesting because it actually mentioned simulation and virtual optimization prior to going to the experiment. This is getting more and more hauled throughout the communities, that this is still something to happen for the chemical sciences, that you would like to optimize things on a computer before going into the lab to make them. Now, this is not really something new, right? So already in the 90s, in the late 90s, people have been thinking about this, and one of the seminal papers is here, there's a paper in Nature from 99, where Francischetti and Zunger sort of provided a concept or discussed the concept where they highlight that if you wish to perform materials design on a computer, you'd have to solve what is known as an inverse problem. So when conventionally you would mimic the experiment in so the conventional physics-based approach is to study a system and then predict its properties and predict its processes. And then you can, of course, falsify things and compare to experiment, right? That's what a proper science does, is falsification. So you would do this in the direct approach. So for us, it would mean you have some materials. So there's a unit cell of some crystal here, and you presume you represent that system, and then you can solve using the quantum mechanics, which so here I'm in Vienna here, and Erwin Schrödinger was in this same faculty, and Ludwig Boltzmann, right? So we know a lot. We had a lot of time to sort of digest these models of nature, and so now we have the computers that we can solve this, and you see we can get something like the band structure, for instance, or other properties. Now, over many decades, people have tried to improve the solvers for these equations, to improve the approximations, and for many compound classes and compound properties, actually we do fairly well nowadays. So you can, in many cases, you can predict properties with error margins that resemble sort of the experimental uncertainty which you would have. So that's, of course, when then no further theoretical development really makes sense, unless you can turn things around and you can ask the question, well, if you're looking for a material that has some properties, so suppose it's supposed to have some band structure, what should the atoms be, right? What should be the composition? What should be the structure? So this is the inverse problem, right? And it is a tricky problem. So these are names of scientists who've been working on this, rather from the materials side. David Barretton is a chemist that Duke University who contributed here, but most others are Matthias or solid state physicists. Now, this is particularly tricky because on top of the forward question being hard to solve, you usually don't have an analytic solution and for inverting that map, and already the forward map is typically not analytical, right? So except for the very simplest model systems, you cannot really invert that map. It can be ill-defined in the sense that it's not really an invertible function. You might have multiple very distinct and distant solutions. It's an incredible high-dimensional space. If you just consider this lattice of the crystal, right? And so you have hundreds of atoms sitting in this unit set, and any atomic site can be populated, at least in principle, by any element from the periodic table, right? So roughly speaking, we have 110 different chemical elements. So you would have something like 110 to the power of the number of sites in terms of combinations. And that's, of course, a gigantic number. And this is so what we refer to when we say chemical compound space. A high dimension optimization problem is always very tough. And then the forward problem, typically when using our physics-based methods, it's not cheap in the sense that you have to pay with CPU time, and compute time, as you're probably aware of, is not an abundant property, and so it's scarce, and you will have to pay for it. So so this is sort of a little bit sort of a perfect storm, right, in terms of a tough problem. So I'm always delighted when younger folks can get interested in this, because I honestly believe that we need all the help we can get for this. So what you see in this box here, though, is some formal solution you could write down, right? So you would like to minimize some target property I, which is determined by the system, so the nuclear charges and the structure of all the atoms, capital I. You would like to minimize its deviation from some reference target property. You might have multiple properties, so you might want to assign some weight to each property, and then you need to navigate this what is known as a Pareto front. Pareto was a very famous Italian scientist who contributed in many fields, and so Pareto fronts are very well-known concept in numerical optimization and applied math. Now, so doing this minimization, of course, is very hard, right? And so this is a little bit the context within which we are trying to speed up things. So basically trying to make this less expensive by providing models that allow us to more rapidly predict these properties. And then you can use those models in order to iteratively try to solve this minimization problem. So the toughest part of this, at least in our work, what we focus on most is this high dimensionality and the behaviors in chemical compound space. And so if you're unfamiliar with chemical compound space, there was a Nature Inside, an entire issue devoted just to this topic in 2004, which might be a good way to enter this topic. So this is on the left, you see it from that paper. On the right, there was in 2017 another comment on chemical compound space, including a nice histogram of the size, the number of compounds that are recorded in certain databases, and what is listed here is PubChem, Zinc, and GDB17. These are so-called legacy databases of listing compounds. Now, GDB17 only contains the molecular graphs. Zinc and PubChem can contain coordinates. These are virtual data sets, really approved drugs, so actually characterized compounds in reality. You see you have much less of such compounds here. And what people think is possible in terms of rules of combinatorics and simple chemical bonding rules like Lewis structures for organic medium-sized chemistry, right? So think aspirin, maybe cocaine, these kind of molecules, you would reach 10 to the 60. Right? Now 10 to the 60 is so gigantic, it doesn't really make sense to talk about this. So you have atoms in the solar system is up here, stars in the universe. We like to give this example. We don't have enough atoms in the universe to make the hard drive, which would store the list of these 10 to the 60 compounds, not speaking about making them or characterizing them, right? Now, and that's just without, so that's only organic chemistry. Of course, we have all inorganic chemistry and the transition metals and etc. So this is really a huge search space, and it is extremely relevant because there can be compounds in the space that can really alter the fate of human mankind. Just think about penicillin. It was just discovered by accident, and it really changed things, right? And so there might be more such surprises in this space, which humanity has simply not discovered yet. And so in some sense, we are a little bit like Europeans before Columbus. We don't even know what's around in our universe. We don't really understand this. We are very much biased to the chemistries we know, and I would encourage you all to think about the possibilities of completely new chemistries. So in our work, we try to use machine learning to accelerate things and quantum mechanics-based understanding. And the idea is a little bit, or the focus lies on trying to exploit correlations in this compound space. And one obvious structure in this compound space, which is also actually shown down here, is of course that there must be the underlying alphabet of the chemical elements, but then you could systematically build up also the environments around each atom. So in this inset here, this comes from a graphic we produced for a paper which was published last year in Nature Chemistry. You could think about it as a third dimension of the periodic table, where in the third dimension you add the environment, the neighbors around each atom, and you can do this by growing this environment. So more and more neighbors, and then eventually, of course, you will have recovered the local chemistry of each atom in all its possible chemistries. And now, if the property of interest, and surprisingly, this is quite often the case, if this property is locally dependent, if it depends only locally on your chemistry, then it can be sufficient to have an additive scalable model that sort of puts together these fragments, if you wish. And so this is what you see here. So down here you see this Nature Chemistry paper where we published this idea, and what you see in this animation are the 1,000 most frequent such fragments in organic chemistry. So it's a box of 10 by 10 by 10 molecules, and so the viewer flies through this. On the left, you see an illustration for the aspirin molecule. So the aspirin atoms are highlighted by the stars. And then on each aspirin atom, we superimpose the same atom, but in a different molecule, right? So up here, for instance, you would have propanol being superimposed with this oxygen and aspirin. And the argument is that there is some relationship, a quantitative correlation among the chemistries of these atoms shared among different molecules. And so if we have a statistical learning tool, we should be able to exploit such correlations. And we try also using quantum mechanics to better understand this. So here's a little cycle, how you could exploit such a tool in order to design things faster. So you would start out with a library of initial compounds, solve some quantum mechanics, get properties, train a machine on this, and then use the machine to explore vast spaces very rapidly and identify new candidates for an updated library, and then solve for them the quantum mechanics, etc. And if you cycle this loop sufficiently long, you should converge to some nice materials, optimal materials. So this is a very general schematic. So now we like to call this quantum machine learning, and in order to avoid the confusion in the field a little bit, there is also the use of quantum machine learning in the sense of in applications of quantum computing. And there's on the Wikipedia entry, you will find this little table here where I think it nicely explains things. So quantum machine learning is any one of these boxes here. You can call the type of algorithm you're using. So you can call this classical or quantum. So quantum algorithm should be able to make use of quantum hardware, right? And then the data you're studying can be classical or it can be quantum. And so our sort of quantum machine learning falls in this box, this QC box. We have quantum data, we have quantum materials, but the machine learning we actually rely on is very classical. So this is a common convention in theoretical chemistry and physics to use the prefix quantum when you study quantum objects with classical methods. So for example, quantum Monte Carlo uses classical Monte Carlo moves in the wave function coefficient space. Quantum Monte Carlo, quantum molecular dynamics does Newtonian dynamics on atoms using quantum forces. So this is very common, and so in analogy to this, we like to use this term quantum machine learning, and the context should then clarify to the reader what we are referring to. I should also make the clarification that using this acronym, we distinguish ourselves a little bit from the more conventional QSPR and QSAR approaches that are around for much longer times, right? And they of course they have gigantic merits, but what our point is rather to incorporate also the underlying quantum physics in the problem. In many bioinformatics approaches, you don't really need that, so then you don't have to use QML, of course. Now there's a friend of mine, Sergei Kalinin. He's an experimentalist at Oak Ridge, and he envies us theoreticians because according to him, theorists know everything. And what he means is that we know where the atoms sit, we place them, right? It's our model, it's part of our model. You have a complete control as a theoretician, how you model your system, and that's what he's referring to. And I think that envy is to some degree quite justified, because it really means that what we are doing in a very strict sense is to do something called supervised learning. We have a causal relationship. Your material will have some properties which are a function of that material. Right? And so in quantum mechanics, that's typically expressed then through Schrödinger's equation, shown down here. So your Hamiltonian represents the system, and then you have to solve this eigenvalue equation. And the Hamiltonian is a differential operator. So this is a differential equation, but it's very very much a deductive thing, right? Same for statistical mechanics. If you calculate your Boltzmann averages, this is also, there's a clear cause and effect relationship, and we even know the structure of these equations, right? And so I argue that we can exploit this very much to our benefit. So incorporating the right physics as it is manifested in these fundamental equations turns out to be really very beneficial for the design and the construction of our machine learning models. Now, what is now chemical compound space in terms of quantum mechanics? And I've picked here one of the most common approaches how this is studied. This is a Kohn-Sham equation, right? So you see for an electron I, you use a Kohn-Sham orbital phi, which is of course spread out over the entire system, right? So it's a quantum description. The electron is not in one point, but all over the place. This is a wave equation. It's also a Schrödinger equation, a single particle Schrödinger equation. So you have your kinetic operator term here, and then you have this dubious Kohn-Sham potential, right? So this is the potential which then would lead to a potential energy. And this gives you an eigenvalue of that orbital. Now, in this potential, right, we put all the dirt in this potential. All the many body effects are embedded in this potential, and we understand, to some degree, we understand this potential very well. It consists of the external potential. It consists of an electronic repulsion potential. There's just electrostatic repulsion between the electrons, and you have here the electron density, which means all other electrons, yes, are encoded here. The electron density is the sum over all other Kohn-Sham orbitals squared. And then you have the exchange correlation potential. And this is really the tricky part of this potential. So a lot of research went into finding improved approximations to this exchange correlation potential. There's proof that the exact potential exists, but nobody knows how it looks like. And so people try to find reasonable assumptions about this using empiricism or using theoretical physics. But for our context here, let's assume you have some decent approximation for this. What really encodes your system, your molecule or your material is the external potential here. And the external potential is just the, again, a Coulomb attraction between your nuclei of the atoms. So the nuclear charge Z, this is the atomic number on the periodic table, right? It records how many protons you have in your nucleus of the atom. So this is what the electrons will feel. They will be attracted to this. And this attraction decays with 1 over R. What you see here now in this single term is the nuclear composition and the coordinates, so the structure of your system. That's where it is encoded. This is how it enters quantum mechanics, right? So as you go through chemical compound space, you're varying Z and R, capital R. That's what you're doing, right? And for any such combination, you can solve this Schrödinger equation and get a different answer. So this means chemical compound space really scales with 4 Ni, where Ni is the number of atoms, and you have the 3 dimension for the coordinates, and the 4th dimension is for the nuclear charge, the Z. Right? So the 4th dimension is not really a real number. In reality, of course, it's a natural number and no larger than 110. But for theory, actually, we can also have fractional nuclear charges. You can solve quantum mechanics for fractional nuclear charges. That has, of course, no correspondence in reality, but you can still extract meaningful physics out of it and meaningful properties, right? So think about it as a very coarse approximation to reality. Even such coarse approximations can still be helpful in guiding decisions. And then you have this one here, this one additional dimension is the number of electrons, right? So in a neutral, charge neutral system, the sum of all your protons must be equals the number of electrons. Now you can have different charges, so the number of electrons can vary, but typically it doesn't vary much. So it's plus or minus 1 or 2 or 3 maybe. So it's also not a real dimension, if you wish, or it's not a dimension that is being fully sampled in reality. Now, the number of atoms in your system, of course, can be very large. If you think about a protein like insulin, right? So then you can have millions of atoms. So this is the problem, right? This kind of dimensionality with which you will have to cope as you explore the space. Now, in that space, right? So if I take all my coordinates, my nuclear charges, and my number of electrons, these are my independent variables. Any compound would be a point, and here, so here, for example, I have N2. So this view is also summarized in a review I wrote a couple of years ago, if you want to read up more on this. Now, in this space, you can vary the nuclear charges, right? So N2 would be neighbored by carbon monoxide, BF, beryllium, neon, or you do it in the other side, in the other direction. So you have your 2 nuclear charges of N2 at Z equals 7. You change one to 8, the other one to 6, that's CO, or the other way around is OC, and that's of course symmetric, right? So your potential energy, which you can calculate by solving the Cohen-Sham equation, the electronic part to your potential energy really looks like this inverted parabola, and on this ridge here, you see the binding curve of N2, okay? And if you go to a different nuclear charge combination, then you see the binding curve of CO and BF, etc. And so this is to show you that chemical compound space in terms of quantum mechanics is actually quite smooth. It's not a crazy idea to say, I'm gonna Taylor expand in here. I'm gonna do a regression in this space, right? Now, of course, in reality, you will measure an equilibrium distance, so only one point, and you will measure it for a certain composition, right? So you might think, you might be fooled into believing this space is discrete somehow, but quantum mechanics, our understanding of matter, which is reflected by quantum mechanics, tells us that within our understanding, that space is perfectly smooth. Now, there are interesting relationships, right? And I just mentioned Taylor expansions, and perturbation theory is basically nothing else than a Taylor expansion. So here you see this from a different paper. This is from this FISREF research we published last year. If you take N2, this is the electron density, and then you perturb it towards CO or BF, right? Then you get these perturbed electron densities as a function of order. So this is the first, second, third, fourth derivative of the electron density, and you pile them up as a Taylor expansion, and you can predict the electron density of CO or BF based on N2 and its expansion in its derivatives. So you see that this works very well. If you compare these electron densities to the actual electron densities you would obtain when solving the quantum mechanics for those, you would hardly see the difference. Now, another much more recent thing which just got accepted in Science Advances is that we also discovered a symmetry relation. You see CO and OC are trivially symmetric, but if you go to higher dimensions, for instance, benzene, you can change the composition in non-trivial ways. And here you see one benzene molecule which has the doping pattern of NBBN, and below benzene which was doped with BNNB. And now traditional chemistry rules would tell you, well, these are two completely different constitutional isomers. There's no symmetry operation you can apply to superimpose them, except for such a symmetry relation in the nuclear charge space. So if you change your nitrogen So you go from here to boron, or the boron from nitrogen. That's of course the same distance in nuclear charge. And so we call these two alchemical enantiomers. The corresponding electronic perturbed densities are shown here. You see they are virtually identical. And indeed, these two constitutional isomers are approximately up to third order degenerate in their energy. So we call this an alchemical chirality, right? Now, such relations are fairly unknown and they haven't been exploited yet, right? So within machine learning, we can implicitly make use of this. Now, coming now to the use case of machine learning, we have to rely mostly on quantum results for training and testing. And what you typically have is a hierarchy of methods, such as force field, semi-empirical methods, Hartree-Fock methods, perturbation. Hartree-Fock is a mean field method, perturbation-based approaches, or explicitly correlated methods like quantum Monte Carlo or coupled cluster. And depending on the level of theory you're using here, you will have to invest a lot of CPU time. And now, if you are willing to invest this, your prediction in comparison to the experiment is going to become increasingly accurate, right? And so you have to negotiate between the money you are willing to spend for CPU time and the accuracy you would like to obtain. So this is a very well-known trade-off. And if you happen to find a new method which at constant cost gets you something more accurate, right? This might be a reason for you to get a ticket to Stockholm and meet the king. So this happened for density functional theory in 98. Now, using machine learning, we would like to sort of mimic this. We would like to exploit correlations among molecules or materials, and we would like this method to become increasingly more accurate. And as the term implies, right, as it should be learning, which means as you provide more examples, it should become better, right? So by construction, monitoring our error as a function of training set size, this should be our figure of merit, how we can validate and verify that the models do what we are hoping to. Now, once you train the model, the real appeal comes from applying the trained model to new cases, and there you make a prediction error then that should resemble your training, the prediction error, the cross-validated error you've obtained in your training. And so you can use this model then to computationally very efficiently make predictions for new compounds with high accuracy. And what we've observed is gains in many orders of magnitudes in CPU time while reaching quantum accuracy. And that is really what got us very exciting. This happened roughly 10 years ago when we were at a workshop in an Institute for Pure and Applied Mathematics, where I organized a program on navigating chemical compound space. And with friends and colleagues of mine, we managed to get this working. And so this was in 2011 on the archive, if you bother to look it up. Now, there's something really interesting. This picture I'm showing here is actually quite accurate in terms of machine learning, in the flavor we like to use, which is a kernel-rich regression method. Now, kernel-rich regression methods would estimate some property of some material M as a simple sum, a linear combination over your training instances. So if each point here in this simplex I'm showing up here, each point is a compound, you're basically just summing up all these compounds. You weigh each point by a regression coefficient alpha I, which carries the units of your property, and you multiply it with a similarity function, a kernel function, typically between 0 and 1, that tells you how distant is your query compound from the training compound. So it's a super simple, very robust model. And there's a closed form solution for the regression coefficients shown here. You have to invert the kernel matrix spanned by all your training instances, right? So once you're trained on this, you can make a new prediction anywhere in between here, and that's very fast. Now, Vapnik, who sort of formalized this approach in the 90s within statistical learning theory, he also showed with colleagues that the prediction error, the leading term of the prediction error must decay inversely with training set size. And this means if you logarithmize the error and the training set size term, you should obtain a linear form. So this pink arrow is actually quite accurate. This is how it should look like if your error and your training set size is being logarithmized, okay? So we've spent a lot of our time over the last couple of years in exploring how can we improve the offset of such learning curves, how can we improve the slope, how can we avoid models that cease to learn, so which after reaching some training set size no longer learning, they are no longer machine learning models, right? I cannot tell you everything about that. But I'd just like to briefly give you a glimpse on what is the impact on the functional form of the representation you pick for your compound. And this is shown here. So we've seen that in our work that the representation matters a lot. We've seen that you can combine things with legacy quantum methods. So the methods like Hartree-Fock or MP2 can be exploited. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you already have some knowledge, some legacy method, it's possible to exploit that. And also, of course, the selection and scalability of your machine learning models is something which also dramatically affects these learning curves. So here in this essay in 2018 in Angewandte, I sort of summarized my view on this. More recently, in this Nature Chemistry review, we gave sort of an overview on where we think the field is at. So just an example of how the representation affects these learning curves. These are errors, mean absolute errors on atomization energies of organic molecules. It's a data set called QM9, which my group published in 2014. And it records for over 100,000 organic molecules, all sorts of electronic properties. Now, the Coulomb matrix called CM here is one of these representations. This is the first one we started with, and you see, obviously, clearly it's a linear curve here. You do have learning, right? It's a functional machine learning model, but with this representation Bob, it's just a different representation. Same kernel, same data set. You improve the offset dramatically, right? And this kind of observation which we made in between 2012 and 2015, continued to be true for further representation. And there's a force field based representation. Then there was a neural network by with Google. Then we had a renewed neural network. Also here, this DTNN is a deep tensor neural network. More recently, these are kernel methods with new representation based on distributions rather than on vectors. These are giving even better performance. And the most recent picture I have, and this is the one published in this review also, looks like this. And you see many different groups from all around the world contributed models here, and they are sort of summarized here. Generally, among the best neural networks is these purple squares here, but usually the kernel-rich regression methods, at least for this data set and this property, seem to outperform everybody else. This is quite intriguing to us, and so some professors in the field joined forces to define a QM9 challenge. So if you can come up with a model that would predict a machine learning model that would give this error here, so for 100 training instances, an error of this roughly chemical accuracy, then everyone on this list agreed to pay you each $100. But of course, this model would be extremely interesting. Now, today, and I'm not sure how much time I have left. I prepared things for 3 recent papers. I will probably just briefly touch on them due to time. But I'd like to tell you that we've tackled reactions, we've tackled free energies, and we've tackled the prediction of 3D structure, always using this kind of QML approach. So for reaction, we created a data set called QM Reaction, which was published last year. And in particular, it's starting out with the same scaffold. We did an SN2 and an E2 reaction, so an elimination and a substitution reaction. So you see the substitution to the left and the elimination to the right, and these are competing reactions. And so using this data set, we were wondering if we can study this with machine learning. Here you see a distribution of the activation energy. I should mention to those who are less familiar with chemistry that these barrier heights, they determine the kinetic stability, right? So you have a trade-off between thermodynamic stability, which means the energy difference between your reactant and the product. So they are competing, right? But you also have to take into account the kinetic stabilization. So something that's very high lying in a minimum, but which is surrounded by very high barriers, will be, of course, very, very stable. And possibly more stable than a compound, counterintuitively, a compound which is lower lying, but which has lower barriers where the system can escape to an even deeper minimum somewhere else. So these fundamental underlying principles, of course, contribute to the richness of chemistry and reactions. And so we were after trying to see if we can machine learn this. So these were the distributions of activation energies, and here you see some learning curves now of the activation energies, and you will notice we reached this level of MP2 accuracy, which for chemical reactions is sort of state of the art in order to estimate these barriers. And you see we have multiple machine learning models that differ by representation here, where we reach this accuracy threshold already for 1,000 compounds or so. Another thing one can do with these reactions is to use a legacy method, and what experimentalists very much like for reactive chemistry is known as the Hemet's equation. The Hemet's equation relates or postulates a relationship between the free energy difference also the equilibrium constant to a product of 2 factors. One, rho stands for the reaction type, so in our case, elimination or substitution. The other factor, sigma, typically stands for the chemical composition. And we wanted to see if this simple ansatz also performs for this data set. Now you can build a whole system of equations and then optimize, treat the sigmas as regression coefficients in a linear system of equations, and like this you can even out the noise, of course, and that's something we did for the 2 reactions, elimination and substitution, and then we can make predictions for new compounds. So this is shown here in the last equation. A typical Hemet prediction would be for the activation energy of a new reactant I here. You need the minimum energy and then some reference information, right, from other reactions, and like this you predict basically through compound space a reactive property. So Hemet was is 80 years old, or 100 years maybe. So this is a very well established, very empirical approach. And we see, thanks to our overall optimization, including all training instances, we can get a better scatter plot with the true numbers. And overall, for different leaving groups and nucleophiles, you see here the overall error over different, more conventional ways is favorable. We can also have a learning curve. So if you learn the activation energy directly, you get this red curve. If you use Hemet as a baseline, you learn the correction to Hemet, you gain a lot, in particular for small training set sizes. And this is very relevant because often for tricky, difficult properties, you have very few data sets. Now, let me switch gears. This is a different paper which just came out, I think, last week, where we looked at learning free energies. And in particular, we realized there are some properties where, and free energies are among them, where you would require a constant representation. Let me qualify. This tells you here is a number, a frequency analysis of different conformers, and the molecular graphs are plotted here. So these are different molecules, and they have different conformers. And for each conformer, you can use a model to predict its solvation energy. Okay, for each configuration. So you see here how this solvation energy estimate varies as you go through these conformers, and you see a lot of variance in here. And this is very scary because depending on which conformer you pick, right, you might be off by 4K Kappa mode. So for instance, in this purple case here, in your free energy of solvation, which is a very substantial number. So for free energies, of course, what we ought to do really is to sample phase space. And so what is required is the calculation of an expectation value like this. And this really means that we should use as a representation something that is Boltzmann sampled, and we can do that by running molecular dynamics and then averaging over these coordinates, right? And so you would have an average of an isomer A, an average of an isomer B, etc., for each compound and compound space, and then you build a machine learning model to infer the average of a new query isomer as shown here in pink. So that was the idea of this paper, and it worked very well. We call it the free energy machine learning, so FML. And so we used as a training set experimental data, the free solve database published by Mobley and co-workers. And you see here the distribution. Unfortunately, there are less than 500 molecules. These are experimental numbers, so this is very costly. We can run molecular dynamics on these compounds, generate the averaged representation, and then use the experimental solvation energies here as a label to train our coefficients. And then we can make a prediction for a new compound. You first have to run a short MD for your query compound, and then you use that as a representation to predict the free energy of solvation for the new query. Now, how well does this work? Here you see learning curves come systematically down. Here in red is the ensemble one. You see in green and orange here common models. So something based on the ECFP4 representation, which is a common graph-based model, or the CQ, which is another common representation, have worse learning curves. In terms of scatter plots, you see that this FML performs very well. And we also have a table here. So one of the most popular methods in the field is Cosmo. And you see it predicts at best 0.52, an error of 0.52. You see that FML here predicts 0.57. And that is for a fixed training set size, right? So Cosmo is sort of converged in the sense it's not a machine learning model, but if we had more training data, our learning curves would suggest that we could achieve even better accuracy. We can use this model then to predict solvation energies for all of QM9, right? And this is what you see here now. There's a distribution of all free energies of solvation for QM9. And we can see that here in pink is highlighted. These are all hydrocarbons, right? So we can locate clusters depending on compositions and an important property like this in chemical compound space. So the extreme compounds we predict based on this model are shown here. So the most solvable and the least solvable are here. So some are even repulsive according to the model. They would just fly out of your aqueous solution according to this model. And we can recover typical trends, so hydrogen donors or NH or H groups they affect their number affects the solvation energy, and these are trends we can rediscover. If we had not known about such trends, we could rediscover it this way, right? This is then finally something we would compare to. If this was our training data set, you see we reach here much more data in this 10 to 20 kcal per mole window, thanks to a machine learning model trained on a distribution which is rather between the 0 and 1, 0 and 10. Okay, Matthias switched on his camera. I think this means I should stop. Is this correct, or do I have a little bit more time?
So if you have a concluding slide, that's fine, but we really have to stop now in the next minute.
Okay, so let me skip this third paper I wanted to tell you about. Unfortunately, I spent a little bit too much time in the beginning, but I hope that helped to better explain things. So in this third paper, we used machine learning to reconstruct geometries, to predict new geometries given a graph as an input. And also here we have some learning curves, but I will not discuss this in detail. We call this the graph to structure machine, G2S. So in summary, so we have the laws of physics on which we can rely, right? It makes me, so I'm not awake at night worrying about the correctness of our approach, because I know we can fall back to these laws of physics, and that's a very comfortable position. And I told you about these learning curves. I hope you saw a little bit how useful and powerful they are. Yeah, I think they are tremendous in assessing the performance of these models. And you can think about what is happening here conceptually. If you're wondering, is this just an incremental thing now, or is this really a revolution? I would argue what you have here is, of course, the traditional sciences started out with the experiment, then we built some theory, such as statistical and quantum mechanics, and then over the last decades, we had computers come to the world, right? And we use them in simulation, in numerical simulation. And now we have, thanks to having access to more data, we can actually really make use of statistics, right? And so that's like, for me, this is the fourth pillar of science now, that we have an additional pillar here where we can build surrogate models that really exploit the data that becomes increasingly more available. So seeing the fact that we can control accuracy and that we get speed ups by orders of magnitudes, I believe it's rather a revolution, but of course that's a personal take. Most of the methods we develop end up in this QML code. It's on the GitHub. If you wish to contribute or use it, please feel free. We also published a book last year in the lecture notes in physics, where many people in the field contributed chapters. So if you want to delve more into the physics-based applications, that might also be a good place to start. And then finally, I should disclose that I'm editor in a new journal published by the Institute of Physics in the UK, called Machine Learning, Science and Technology. So this is not a machine learning journal, but a journal meant to be for this interdisciplinary space where machine learning methods can be developed. Also here, there's many scientists are on the editorial board. So if you have a paper where you think that machine learning has helped with your respective science, this might be a good venue to consider. And finally, I should acknowledge the people who actually did the work. So they are highlighted here in pink. In particular, Marco did the reaction work with the Hemet equation, as well as Stefan Heinen here, and Dominic Lem did the structure prediction, and Jan Van Rijk the solvation, and Guido von Rudolph and Nick Browning helped supervising these PhD students. I enjoy receiving a lot of funding for now, so I have to acknowledge these agencies. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your attention, of course. Thank you very much.